The dining room carried the warmth of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, yet beneath it lingered a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The table was set with care, the kind that suggested an evening meant for connection, but the air between father and daughter was already strained. She moved gracefully around the table, serving dishes, smiling for the sake of politeness, but her eyes avoided his. Conversation flowed between her and her husband, stories of their busy week, the parties they'd attended, and the investments they were considering. He sat quietly, listening, nodding now and then, but offering little. Years had taught him that sometimes silence spoke more than words ever could. Then, in the middle of a casual discussion about finances, she turned to him with a faint laugh and said, "You have nothing left, do you?" The words were tossed out like an observation, but the sting was sharp and deliberate. She didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she did, and that was the point. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest, heavy and cold. His fingers tightened slightly on the fork, but his face remained calm. A faint smile curved at his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded once, as if to agree, though deep inside, something stirred. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the quiet ache of a father who had given everything, only to be measured in material worth. Across the table, his son-in-law leaned back in his chair, a smug little grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He said nothing, but the look was enough, one of silent superiority, as though the words had confirmed what he already believed. He let the moment pass, lifting his glass to take a slow sip of water, using the pause to steady himself. The room carried on as though nothing had been said. But for him, the world had shifted. There was no dramatic argument, no raised voices, just a single sentence that had carved its place into his heart. And as he sat there, quietly watching the people he loved, he knew that while they thought he had nothing, they had no idea what he still carried within him. The streets were nearly empty as he stepped out into the night, the faint glow of street lamps stretching shadows across the pavement. His coat did little to shield him from the cold. The air bit at his skin, but the deeper chill came from somewhere else entirely. Each footstep echoed softly, a slow rhythm that matched the heaviness in his chest. He didn't rush. There was no need. The silence around him was almost comforting, a space where no one could add to the words that still rang in his ears. "You have nothing left." They had been spoken so casually, yet they clung to him like frost. As he walked, his mind wandered back over the years, to the sacrifices made without hesitation. The second job he had taken when she was still a little girl, just so she could go to the school she dreamed of. The nights he'd gone without new clothes so she could have a dress she loved. The way he'd hidden his own hunger during lean years, telling her he had already eaten. None of it had felt like a burden at the time. It had been joy, a father's duty done with pride. But somewhere along the way, the warmth had thinned. Phone calls became rare. Visits were shorter. Her words were less about us and more about them. He had told himself it was just life, people grow, priorities shift, but deep down he knew there was a gap between them now that hadn't always been there. A gust of wind caught at his scarf, pulling it loose. He wrapped it back around his neck, his fingers stiff from the cold. The darkness above was clear, stars pricking the sky, but their beauty felt distant, untouchable. He thought of how once, long ago, she would have slipped her small hand into his as they walked home together. Now the space beside him was empty. Regret pressed in, not for the things he had given, but for the closeness that had slipped away despite them. Love was still there, unshaken, unwavering, but it lived behind walls now, waiting for a moment when it could be welcomed again. Until then, he would carry it in silence, just as he carried her words home with him through the cold. He closed his eyes for a moment as he walked, and the cold street around him dissolved into the warm haze of memory. Suddenly, he was back in that tiny apartment, years ago, when she was no taller than his knee. Her laughter filled the space like sunlight spilling through the window. The sound of her bare feet running across the floor, the way she would launch herself into his arms as soon as he came home. It was all so vivid it almost hurt. He remembered the day they bought her first school uniform. The fabric was a little stiff, the skirt a bit too long, but she had twirled in front of the mirror as though she was wearing a ball gown. He had knelt to pin the hem, his hands careful, his heart swelling with pride. She had looked at him with shining eyes and whispered, "I'm going to be the smartest in class, Daddy." Nights were often long back then. After dinner, when the city outside quieted down, they would sit together at the small kitchen table, heads bent over math problems and spelling words. Sometimes she would grow frustrated, scrunching her nose and tapping her pencil against the page, but he never lost patience. They would work through each mistake until the answers came, and when they did, her face would light up as though she had conquered the world. They had their little traditions too. Ice cream on Fridays, no matter the weather. Evening walks to the park where she'd chatter endlessly about her dreams. First she wanted to be a teacher, then a doctor, then someone who helps everyone. Every word she spoke had been precious to him, every dream something he wanted to protect. Their bond had been unshakable then, a thread woven from trust, laughter, and the quiet knowledge that no matter what, they belonged to each other. Even in the lean years, when money was scarce and life was hard, the two of them had found joy in small things, a shared sandwich, a hammer-down toy, a story read aloud before bed. And now, walking alone in the present, he felt the ache of those memories. They were warm, but they were also distant, belonging to a time when love had been enough and the world hadn't yet come between them. It hadn't happened all at once. In the beginning, after her wedding, things still felt almost the same. She would call him on Sunday evenings, telling him about the new recipes she was learning, the trips they were planning. He remembered feeling relieved, grateful that marriage hadn't taken her away from him. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to change. It started with her being too busy to visit as often. The weekly calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. When they did meet, her words carried a different weight. Subtle corrections on how he spoke, faintly embarrassed smiles when he talked about his work. Once, at a dinner with her friends, she had laughed lightly and said, "Dad's not really into these modern things, he's old-fashioned." He had laughed with them, but inside, it stung. Her new social circle seemed polished, confident, and always just a little distant with him. They spoke in terms of investments, luxury travel, and property portfolios, as though these were the only measures of success. He often found himself sitting quietly at gatherings, their conversations gliding past him like a language he no longer understood. The influence of her husband was subtle but undeniable. The young man was courteous in public, but his politeness felt like a layer over something colder. There were small moments, being excluded from certain conversations, noticing how decisions were made without her even glancing his way, or the way her husband would answer for her when he asked about visiting. The first real cut came one afternoon when he dropped by with a small gift, a hand-carved jewelry box he had made himself. She accepted it with a quick thanks, set it on the counter, and went back to discussing vacation plans with her husband. Later, when he visited again, he saw the box pushed to the back of a cupboard, gathering dust. From then on, the distance grew. Invitations became rare, and when they did arrive, they felt more like obligations than genuine gestures. The warmth in her eyes when she looked at him as a child was gone, replaced with a kind of polite tolerance. And while there had been no dramatic argument to sever the bond, he knew, deep down, that something precious had shifted and perhaps was slipping away entirely. For years, tucked away in the quiet corners of his life, he had guarded something few knew about, a stretch of land on the outskirts of the city, a place he had bought when she was still small enough to sit on his shoulders. It wasn't grand in the way her friends might brag about on social media, but to him, it was more valuable than any mansion. Rolling green hills, an old oak tree that shaded half the field, and a modest farmhouse that he'd repaired with his own hands. It had been his dream, a place he once imagined passing down to her, a sanctuary she could always return to, no matter where life took her. He had never spoken of it, not once, not even when times were hard, when selling it could have made his life easier. Friends had asked why he didn't use it to upgrade his home, to live more comfortably. His answer was always the same, a quiet smile, a shake of the head. The truth was, He wanted her to grow up valuing things that couldn't be bought or sold. If she knew too soon, he feared the gift would lose its meaning, becoming just another number to add to her net worth rather than a piece of her heart. Every spare bit of money from his working years had gone into keeping it safe. Property taxes paid on time, repairs done without hesitation. He remembered standing there alone some evenings, the breeze carrying the smell of grass, imagining her walking across it as an adult, maybe with children of her own, telling them, "This was your grandfather's gift to me." The place carried pieces of his own story too. The oak tree had been where he sat with her mother before they were married, planning a life neither of them knew would turn out so differently. The farmhouse still had a loose kitchen tile he'd promised to fix but never did. He always said he liked the way it clicked underfoot, like the place itself had a heartbeat. It wasn't just land. It was years of sacrifice, of holding back from speaking, of waiting for the right moment when she could truly understand what it meant. He knew that in her world now, one of glittering parties and expensive handbags, it might not look like much. But for him, it was the sum of a lifetime's love, something that money could measure in numbers, but only memory and sacrifice could give its true worth. He had kept it silent all these years because some treasures aren't meant to be flaunted, they are meant to be discovered. And when the time came, he hoped it would not just surprise her, but remind her of the man who, no matter what she believed, had never stopped giving her everything he had. He could have defended himself that night at the dinner table. He could have listed every sacrifice, every long hour worked, every silent compromise made for her sake. But words, he knew, would only fall flat against the wall she had built. Arguments would turn into just another point for her to dismiss, another reason to believe she was right. So instead, he chose silence, not the kind that surrenders, but the kind that plans. If she believed he had nothing left, then the truth would have to be shown, not spoken. And when it came, it wouldn't be a boast or a lecture. It would be a moment she could never forget. That night, he sat at his small kitchen table, a single lamp casting a circle of light over a stack of old documents. Property deeds, tax records, photographs of the land in different seasons. They had been sitting untouched for years. He ran his hands slowly over them, as though touching the paper might make the memories inside it more vivid. In the days that followed, he began to make quiet arrangements. A discreet call to the lawyer he trusted, one who had handled the land's paperwork since the beginning. A visit to the bank, where the manager, an old acquaintance, greeted him with surprise. He hadn't been there in years. Together, they discussed the best way to transfer ownership when the time was right, and how to prepare the document so that the meaning would be clear, not just the numbers. He didn't tell anyone where he was going during these trips. To the outside world, he was simply running errands. But in his mind, each meeting, each signature, was a step toward the moment he was building, a single day when her perception of him would shift forever. He wanted her to open the gift and see more than its value. He wanted her to see the years hidden inside it, the love wrapped in its quiet preservation. No grand speeches, no need to remind her of the words she'd said. Just the truth, delivered in a way that would leave her with nothing to argue against, nothing to deny. And so, with calm resolve, he kept moving forward, not with bitterness, but with the patient certainty of a man who knew that sometimes the loudest answer is the one given in absolute silence, until the right moment to speak. In the quiet of his small home, he began laying everything out on the dining table. The documents came first. The property deed, neatly folded in its protective sleeve, edges worn from years of safekeeping. He placed it in the center like the foundation stone of everything else. Around it, he spread out photographs taken over decades, her in her first school uniform, grinning with missing teeth, her standing under the great oak tree on the land, holding a kite string, the two of them side by side in front of the half-repaired farmhouse, both of them smeared with paint from the day they'd painted its shutters. Each item he chose had to mean something beyond numbers. There was the small brass key to the farmhouse, polished smooth from years in his pocket. A pressed flower she had once picked for him when she was 7, kept between the pages of an old book. Even a faded receipt for the uniform they had bought together, the ink barely legible but the memory still sharp. Then came the letter, He took out a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, the kind that felt solid in the hand, as though it could carry more than just words. He began slowly, not with explanations, but with memories. He wrote of the first time he saw her walk, the first time she called him daddy, the night she cried over a failed exam, and how proud he'd been when she tried again. He told her about the land, how he'd bought it when she was still small enough to ride on his shoulders, how he dreamed it would be Hayes one day, not as a prize but as a place where she would always belong. He explained the sacrifices without bitterness, the second job he took, the vacations he skipped, the nights he ate less so she could have more. But woven between the lines was something deeper, the unspoken truth that his love for her had never depended on her gratitude. His hand trembled as he signed his name at the bottom, not from weakness, but from the weight of putting so much of his heart on paper. When he folded the letter, he slipped it into an envelope and placed it atop the deeds and photographs. Carefully, he found a wooden box he had built years ago in his workshop. Inside, he arranged everything with deliberate care. The deed beneath the letter, the photograph stacked neatly beside the key, the flower tucked gently into the corner. He closed the lid slowly, his fingers lingering on the smooth grain of the wood. It wasn't just a gift. It was a life, his life, distilled into something she could hold in her hands. And when she opened it, he hoped she would see not just what it contained, but everything it had taken to create it. He waited a full day before picking up the phone, not because he doubted his decision, but because he wanted to be sure his voice carried no trace of hurt or accusation. When he finally dialed her number, it rang longer than usual before she answered. "Dad." Her tone was cautious, as if wondering why he was calling. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "maybe we could meet. Just the two of us. There's something I'd like to give you." There was a pause on the line. He could almost hear her weighing the request, measuring it against whatever filled her calendar now. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice edged with curiosity and mild suspicion. "Nothing bad," he assured her. "Just important." After another moment of silence, she sighed. "All right. Where?" He'd already decided on the place. "Do you remember the old park near our first home? The one with the oak tree?" She hesitated. "I haven't been there in years." "I know," he replied gently. "That's why I thought it might be right." The park wasn't just convenient. It was symbolic. It was where he had taken her as a child to feed ducks and fly kites, where they had sat on worn wooden benches eating ice cream, where her laughter had once been as constant as the rustle of leaves overhead. He wanted the weight of memory in the air when she opened what he had prepared. "Fine," she said at last. "Saturday." "Saturday," he confirmed. When the call ended, he sat for a moment with the phone still in his hand. The conversation had been polite but distant, the way it always seemed to be now. Still, she had agreed, and that was all he needed. He pictured the park as it would look that day, the grass worn in places from years of footsteps, the bench beneath the oak tree weathered but sturdy, the breeze carrying a familiar scent of earth and leaves. It was the kind of place where the noise of the present seemed to fade, letting the past breathe for a while. There, he would give her the box. There, she would see what she thought no longer existed. And perhaps, in that quiet space, the truth would speak louder than all the words he had chosen not to say. He arrived at the park early, the wooden box resting carefully on his lap as he sat on the old bench beneath the oak tree. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp grass. A few joggers passed by, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter rang out, a sound that tugged at something deep inside him. When she finally appeared, he saw her before she saw him. Her pace was brisk, her posture sharp, as though she was walking into a meeting that needed to be over quickly. She wore a tailored coat, a scarf wrapped neatly around her neck, her phone in one hand. "Hi, Dad," she said, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello," he replied warmly, rising to his feet. He motioned toward the bench. "Sit with me." She glanced at her watch before taking a seat, crossing her legs. "So, what's this about? You sounded mysterious on the phone." There was an edge of impatience in her voice, the kind that came from someone who felt their time was being borrowed. She set her phone beside her, screen facing up, as if ready to glance at it at the first vibration. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he studied her face for a moment. The familiar lines of her features, the echoes of the little girl she used to be, now shadowed by distance. "I have something for you," he said at last, his voice calm, steady. Her brows lifted slightly. "For me? What is it?" He reached down, resting his hands gently on the box. "Something I've kept for a very long time." She tilted her head, curiosity battling with skepticism. "Is this another one of your keepsakes? Old photos or something?" He smiled faintly. "Something like that." There was no tension in his posture, no rush to open the box and prove a point. He simply sat there, letting the moment settle between them, the rustling leaves filling the quiet. She exhaled, leaning back a little. "All right, let's see it then." He didn't move immediately. His fingers lingered on the smooth wood, feeling its weight. In a moment, he said softly, "Some things deserve to be given slowly." She frowned slightly, but he kept his gaze steady, knowing that in just a few minutes, the look in her eyes would be entirely different. He slid the wooden box toward her, the grain catching faint streaks of sunlight that filtered through the branches above. For a moment, she just looked at it, one brow raised. Then, with a small sigh, she unlatched the brass clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was arranged with deliberate care. The first thing she noticed was a folded envelope resting neatly on top. Beneath it, a stack of documents bound with a thin ribbon, their edges worn with age. Beside them lay a cluster of photographs, their colors softened by time, and a small brass key, polished from years of handling. She glanced at him briefly, as if expecting an explanation, but he only nodded toward the envelope. "Start there," he said quietly. She pulled it out and slid a finger under the flap. The paper inside was thick, the handwriting instantly familiar, steady, deliberate strokes she remembered from notes he used to tuck into her lunchbox as a child. "My dearest," it began. The words drew her in, her eyes moving slowly across each line. He wrote of the day she was born, the way he had promised himself he would give her the best life he could. He spoke of the land he had bought when she was small enough to carry on his shoulders, the same land he had spent decades preserving for her. He wrote of the nights he worked 2 jobs, the meals he quietly skipped, the things he went without, not because he had to, but because he wanted her to have more. There was no bitterness in his words, no accusations, only a steady current of love. "You once told me I had nothing left," the letter read, "but everything I have, I've saved for you." Her hands trembled slightly as she set the letter down and reached for the documents. Property deeds, bank records, letters from his lawyer confirming ownership of land she had never known existed. The photographs told their own story, her grinning under the shade of an oak tree, him painting the shutters of a small farmhouse, the two of them standing in a field awash in golden light. The brass key felt warm in her palm, though she knew it had been resting in the box for years. She looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for something. He met her gaze with quiet steadiness, the same calm he carried since the night she'd spoken those words. It sank in slowly, painfully. Nothing left had never been true. He had not only kept something, he had kept everything, hidden away not to punish her, but to give it at the right time. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The weight of the box in her lap felt heavier than its size suggested, not from the deeds or the photographs, but from the years of sacrifice it represented. For a long moment, she sat frozen, the letter trembling in her hands, her eyes glistening. The sound of leaves rustling overhead was the only thing filling the silence between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, broken around the edges. "Dad, I didn't know." He gave a faint smile, one that carried no trace of reproach. "You weren't meant to," he replied gently. "Not until it mattered." Her gaze dropped to the documents again, then to the photographs. She brushed her thumb over the image of her younger self standing beside him in the field, the two of them grinning at the camera. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. She shook her head slowly. "I was so wrong. I thought you." Her words caught in her throat, and she pressed her lips together to keep from breaking entirely. He leaned back slightly, studying her with a quiet calm. You thought I had nothing left. And maybe I let you believe that. But I never measured my life in what I could hold in my hands. She swallowed hard. I said terrible things to you. I treated you like. He lifted a hand, stopping her. You're my daughter, he said simply. That's always been enough. Her breath hitched. She looked at him then, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes carved by years of laughter and work, at the steady patience in his gaze. I don't deserve this, she whispered. It's not about deserving, he said. It's about giving. That's what love is. The tears came freely now. She set the box aside and leaned forward, her shoulders shaking. For a moment she hesitated, as though unsure if the embrace would be welcomed after so many years of distance. But he opened his arms without a word, and she fell into them like she had as a child, the weight of pride and misunderstanding dissolving in the warmth of that simple, human contact. They stayed like that for a long time, neither speaking. His hand rested gently on the back of her head, her tears dampening the fabric of his coat. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, quick at first, then gradually steadying, as though the years that had pulled them apart were slowly folding back into something whole again. When she finally pulled away, her face was flushed, but her eyes held something new, or perhaps something remembered. A softness, a recognition. She wiped her cheeks and let out a shaky laugh, as if relieved by the release of it all. He reached for the box and placed it back in her hands. This is yours now, he said quietly. Take care of it, and the memories inside it. She nodded, clutching it as though it were far more than paper and wood. And to both of them, it was. In the weeks that followed, something subtle yet profound began to change. She started calling him, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to hear his voice. At first, the conversations were short, a few minutes here and there. But soon they grew longer, weaving through laughter, shared memories, and the kinds of updates she hadn't bothered to give in years. She began visiting more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with her children in tow. The first time she brought them to see the land, her eyes lingered on every corner, the oak tree, the weathered farmhouse, the slope where she had once flown her kite. It was as if she was seeing it all through two sets of eyes, the adult who now understood what it had cost, and the little girl who once only saw the magic. They cooked together again, returning to old recipes she used to watch him make as a child. She laughed at his terrible jokes, the ones that once made her groan, and she listened when he spoke, not with polite nods but with genuine attention. Somewhere between the conversations and the quiet moments, the distance that had grown over the years began to fade, replaced by something warmer, sturdier. For his part, he didn't dwell on the past. He never reminded her of her words at the dinner table, never used the gift as leverage or proof. He had given it freely, and he treated it that way. When she thanked him, and she did, often, he would just smile and say, "It's yours now." One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, they sat together under the oak tree. The breeze was soft, carrying the scent of earth and grass. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, the way she used to when she was small. "I still think about that day in the park," she said quietly. "It changed everything for me." He looked out at the land, the sky stretching wide above them. "It wasn't the land that changed anything," he said. "It was us. We just found our way back." She was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I'm glad we did." He let his gaze linger on the horizon, the weight of years resting softly in his chest. The gift had been important, yes, but not because of its value. The real treasure had always been the connection it helped restore, the reminder that love, once given, doesn't simply vanish. As the last light of the day faded, he thought to himself, "She once believed I had nothing left. But the truth is, I gave her everything." And for the first time in a long time, he felt that she finally understood.